as just said, my bag is politics, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on on the political scene and how that might well both influence and force politicians to reflect on some of those big seismic changes that we can expect to see in our world. So, on the one hand, this looks quite familiar. There's a lot of stuff going on at the moment, filling the newspapers, filling up the TV schedules, which looks from a world that is familiar. A prime minister up to his eyes in the lobbying scandal, football administrators making prats of themselves, and the Scottish National Party, apparently on the verge of romping to victory. This might be 2014, but of course, as we know, we are in the midst of, pretty seismic events with both Brexit to start with as the sort of background context, and then of course COVID, which has dominated everything for the last year. And those two things together, I think, have not only changed the way a lot of business is done in government, but will also change the way we live going forwards. The pandemic has revealed a lot about what works and what doesn't in Whitehall and in government departments and in local government. And it's also caused them to look at the world differently, try to do things differently, because there's been a lot of really big stuff that they've needed to do fast. And it's also created a whole load of problems which politicians and all the rest of us are going to have to deal with going forward. So have a look at those problems to start with. Quite apart from a massive health crisis, which we now appear, touch wood, to be getting on top of, you have got a huge backlog of problems across the whole of government. The health service is the obvious case. Focusing on COVID deaths and saving lives there has meant that there are millions and millions of people who have not had the cancer treatment that they're supposed to have, who have not had the elective operations that they were hoping to have. And so you've got a huge problem there that needs dealing with. The other area that ministers are really concerned about, and Boris Johnson, we are told, is making this his top priority, is a group of kids who are falling dramatically behind as a result of schools being away for the better part of a year. Through the various lockdowns, a lot of schools lost probably 3/4 of their actual teaching time over the last year, even if in most days they were trying to do something via Zoom. As we are today, it's not quite the same as having those kids in the classroom. And what they're finding, of course, is that the people who have the most difficult backgrounds, the most disadvantages, are the people hit hardest by that. So you have a whole raft of problems there that people want to deal with. And a lot of people I speak to in government think that this is a sort of problem that will go on for decades. You will look back in 20, 30 years time and see that people who have fallen behind now will have their life chances considerably hit unless ministers do something about it in the next few months. The other thing that's interesting in a general sense is the issue of trust in politics. And you've seen that hit in a lot of ways in recent years. And the lack of trust appears to be driving a lot of what goes on in politics. There's a very nifty pollster called James Kanagasorian who helped the Tories get loads of seats in Scotland a few years ago, and is quite a sharp guy. He's gone back and looked at the evidence of recent British elections, the Brexit referendum, Jeremy Corbyn doing so well in 2017, Donald Trump's wins in the States, and Boris Johnson's general election victory here, and showing that voters on left and right who mistrust institutions have been the ones turning out to vote in those elections. They're also very hard to find in opinion polls. So politicians who can find them, as Boris Johnson appears to have been able to do, and briefly Jeremy Corbyn did, have a bit of an advantage. So that's going to change the way politics operates and the way the choices those people make will shape the world we're all going to be living in. There are lots of backlogs across Whitehall. You hear that passports is a major issue. Loads of stuff like that has just simply not happened. So government has a huge task on its hand. And as a result of that, what you're going to see in the next few months is a concerted effort to deal with those sort of problems I've been outlining. You're going to have a Queen's speech the second week of May. You'll probably see a cabinet reshuffle. And you're going to then see a whole series of sort of bigger things coming out. There'll be a budget later in the year. We've got the COP summit, where you'll see a massive shift towards green issues and green energy and green jobs to try and rebuild what's going on in the employment sector, which obviously is a looming horror that ministers are very concerned about. Now, the edge has been taken off that. People were predicting 4 million unemployed at one stage. We're at about half that at the moment. But clearly, when the government lifts more of the pandemic support later into the autumn, you've potentially got a huge economic crisis on your hands. You'll see packages of, extra tutoring for kids. You'll see potentially the school day lengthening. And the interesting thing here is that, you've got a government that has shown that it's willing to spend huge amounts of money on tackling problems, and the public no longer seems to mind that. In fact, is pretty, most of the polls suggest that people want to see a step change in how we now operate politically. The debates that were common 10 or 12 years ago are now completely defunct, and this is why Labour is finding it slightly difficult to get a throttle hold on Boris Johnson, because here's a Tory who talks about levelling up and who wants to spend huge amounts of money on infrastructure and on helping out those people who've been hit by this pandemic. So conventional politics is going to look a little bit different. But the most interesting work in government is what's going on about what this might all really mean for the future. Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, and some of the more intelligent ministers, Michael Gove amongst them, are already looking at, yes, we can put loads of money into tutoring kids, but might we be better off thinking, more structurally? Do we need a school day that finishes at 3:30? Could we not extend that? There's obviously problems with the teaching unions in getting them to agree to work longer hours. What about the summer holidays, which are this gargantuan long period, which was based in the old days around people needing to go off and bring in the harvest? That seems to be antiquated now. A lot of people would like to see 4 major terms a year rather than 3, with sort of 2-3 week holidays between them rather than 6. There's a lot of evidence that kids fall behind in that 6-week break. Would that be a better way of doing things? Could we be applying for university based on the results that we've already got, rather than this sort of system that we've had for years, where you get your estimated grades, then you get your place at university, and then you go off after that? So there's a lot of people thinking about those big structural things. The good news is that a lot of what government has had to do over the last year has shown that, there is potential, if you do things right, to do things well, do things at scale, and do things quickly. The vaccine rollout is the obvious example of that. It's a very good blend of some public money going into a private enterprise, and the government backing a whole range of potential vaccines, 7 or 8 of them at once, and a lot of them have come up trumps. People were talking about needing to be take a decade to do these things, certainly 2 to 3 years, and they turned it around in a matter of months. And there's a wartime atmosphere in Whitehall, and in the Second World War you saw huge leaps forward in technology and the health service and all the rest of it, and you're going to get the same to a degree here. Look at what hasn't happened. One of the things I thought was most obviously going to happen last year was when a huge influx of new unemployed went into the benefits system. Knowing that IT in government is useless generally, you all assumed that their Department for Work and Pensions computer system would fall over. Well, it didn't. Someone at the top of government said to me, actually, Ian Duncan Smith, bizarrely, is one of the heroes of COVID, because he insisted on the digitization of the DWP a few years ago in order to bring in this new universal credit benefit. Now, UC has not been a roaring triumph in some places, in terms of the decisions that have been made about who gets it and who doesn't. But on the evidence of what's happened in the last year, the system held up and actually has coped with this. Now, if you can start to see that happening in other departments, you can start to have things working quickly. They've shown that Zoom government works. You don't all have to be in a room together. That creates huge opportunities for moving different parts of government around the country, and that's what Boris Johnson wants to do. The Treasury are, creating various outposts in the north, as are various other government departments. Department of Transport is heading off to the Midlands, large parts of it, and so you'll be able to see things function, on a different basis. The other thing that people might look at differently is, we've probably got a slightly different view of risk now. Ministers always used to do everything up to the last minute. A lot of business and industry did. The health service certainly did. It's possible now that you'll see more capacity built in, more of that sort of comfort zone that you might need in a crisis. So we might approach things differently there. The other stuff, that big picture stuff that I know ministers are looking at is, what does it mean if large numbers of people are working from home? How do we revitalise our high streets if a lot of that office space is no longer required? There are some benefits there. You could create a lot of affordable housing in the centre of towns, and people who've been driven to the margins will suddenly find that it's affordable to live back in the middle again. That could have huge social implications. What about employers and the tax regime? A lot of employers at the moment are resisting paying people who work from home any money for their heating or their electricity. I would have thought if you want to woo the best people to go and work for you, that sort of thing will change, and it could be a process that government encourages with tax breaks for that sort of thing. What does this all mean for the housing market? These are big issues that government has not remotely yet fully got to grips with, but it's encouraging to me, at least, that they are beginning to think about them. And I'm sure some of our future speakers will have more intelligent things to say about them than ministers yet do. The big picture of politics, though, is that there's been a huge sort of seismic shift in who is voting for who and why. Brexit, to a degree, has led to a sort of recalibration. The kind of people who were voting for the Conservative Party 20 years ago, in large number, are not now, partly as a result of Brexit. The map has been redrawn, and the challenge for politicians is to adapt to it quickly and find ways of appealing to people. So COVID has presented huge problems. To a degree, it's highlighted what some of those solutions might be in terms of digitization and more flexible working. And the politicians that can respond most quickly and effectively to these new problems will be the ones that are successful going forward. But what's happened has shaped all our lives. It will shape the government that runs us. And if we don't like what they're doing, we will be electing another one.